want to welcome you all to this session on Orthodoxy and Mission. As I said in a social media post that I recently put up, reminding people to engage with this topic, it's often said in Orthodox circles that mission and orthodoxy don't naturally cohere. There's a sense on the part of some people that the Orthodox don't engage in outreach. But I find that frankly, an absurd notion, because our Lord's command to his disciples before the ascension is to go out into the world and baptize all nations in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. That being the case, we should feel a sense of compulsion to get out. And furthermore, I would say that I don't know how anyone could think that holding the treasure we do, that is the light of the gospel, we could be doing a service to anyone by hiding it. The joy of the gospel, and it is no less than that, is something it is incumbent on us to share, lest we fall into a kind of egocentrism, a focus on ourselves that ultimately serves no one. So I'm going to share my screen and open up a series of slides, none of which will dominate the whole of the sessions, but which will guide us through a few initial thoughts. We begin with the idea that mission, as I've already said, is an Orthodox imperative. And in this case, we take the incarnation as our template. Now, what I mean by that is that Orthodox theology is primarily premised on iconology. In other words, the theology of the icon runs through our thought from beginning to end, from our understanding of the creation of the world to the way we look at the nature of the human person. We understand it to be iconological. We take this from the fact that in Genesis, we're told that at the creation, all things are made in God's image. He declares them to be good. And as we read elsewhere, there is no one good but God. Therefore, that which is created is somehow reflective of God. And of course, as it pertains particularly to humanity, we are created in his image and likeness. Of course, as St. Irenaeus says, when we fall, we lose the image but retain the likeness, and the possibility of manifesting God more fully is restored with the incarnation. But what does the incarnation itself look like, and how does this inform our approach to mission? Well, if we look at elements of the incarnation, we can see in it a reflection of vocation, of calling across the biblical tradition. So in the first instance, we get a response to call. So here we see a line drawing, an iconic line drawing of the Annunciation. Here the Theotokos responds to the call on her to bear the incarnate word in herself. think back to the calling of Isaiah, the prophet, in Isaiah 6, 1-11. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the king sitting upon a throne. And the following verses reflect a splendiferous image of the prophet experiencing God's call on him and his willingness to step forward once he has been purified, in his case. The story of the call of Samuel is not dissimilar. But here we have the call of God on the Theotokos, who then bears Christ in her womb. So there is a response. Then there is a humility, a kenosis, to going out into the world. And so here we see the incarnation, the birth of the Logos in the manger of Bethlehem. What does the Logos undertake? Well, he goes out into the world after the baptism by John the Baptist in the Jordan and his ordeal in the desert. He takes up a ministry first of preaching and teaching, of healing, of feeding the hungry, and ultimately returning to God in worship. So he draws up the prayers of the whole human race as he ascends, and these are laid before the altar of God, as we see in the book of Revelation. So it's a 6-part act, and in that is our template. In that is our template: response, going out into the world, preaching, teaching, healing, feeding, and then returning to God. In this is what in Latin theology is called the exitus et reditus, the procession and the return. Now, those are Latin words, but they actually are, of course, philosophical in nature, drawn from Plato. But you can see them reflected in the movement of the incarnation in this diagram. So you've got an image of the Word of God at the top of this slide. Well, I've illustrated God not in his fullness, because of course we cannot know that completely. We can know God through his revelation, his self-disclosure. And nowhere is that clearer than in the incarnation. So we see there the Word. And what does the Word do but to proceed into the world, to descend from his place at the right hand of the Father, and to take on our form in kenotic fashion, that is, in a form of complete sort of self-emptying. The very Word by which all things are created condescends to enter into our estate. And so we see the incarnation marked by a red star, and all of the activities represented by the previous slide are here denoted by this green arrow illustrating his going about the world. That's the preaching and teaching, healing and feeding. Now, at the center of the mission of the incarnate Logos is, of course, his sacrifice on the cross. And for those of us in the Russian tradition, will know that we celebrated the feast of the exaltation of the Holy Cross just the other day. So the cross is very much central to the mission of the incarnation. It's by the cross that this circle, which is reflective of the circle above is drawn back into a relationship with the circle above, i.e. with God. And it's only by that cross that the complete picture is made possible. So what happens after the cross? Well, of course, there is the resurrection. And so we move into the blue half of the diagram. And the post-resurrection revelation is different to that which precedes it. And the what I mean by this is that whereas the incarnate Logos manifested himself to the world by means of preaching, teaching, healing, and feeding, after that, it's more contained. It's a preparation of the church. He remains with his disciples for 40 more days, during which time he presents them with what you might call last-minute instructions. In other words, he instructs the disciples and lays down the pattern by which they are then to act in his name after his ascension. And so, illustrated by the blue line, that covers the 40 days of his post-resurrection showings. Finally, the third and final star is the moment of the ascension. And here, the same incarnate Logos takes with him all of, as I've already said, the prayers and aspirations of the people, particularly his closest friends and followers, but equally all those of the whole of creation. And with him, creation then returns to the Word. It ultimately leaves us with an image of the divine embrace of all of creation, drawing it back into that intimate relationship with him for which it was created in the first place. The difference this time is that whereas at creation, when the created order is first set in place by the Word of God, and it is done to set it in intimate relationship to him, now it is set to be integrated with him. And we see that in the intermingling of divine and human in Christ. He who is fully God takes on human flesh. And as St. Gregory of Nyssa says, when the nails are driven into his hands and feet on the cross, that divinity and humanity are the marriage of that divinity and humanity is consummated. So they are inextricably bound. And so he literally draws our humanity with him into heaven, which means that it now sits in a place where at creation it did not sit. You might think of creation as being, or the state of paradise into which creation was set in the beginning was a relationship of courting, whereas the incarnation denotes its marriage. And as I say, as St. Gregory of Nyssa declared, the union effected on the cross is its consummation. So it is a deeper and more thoroughgoing relationship that we now hold with the everlasting and loving God. So I'm going to take it off that slide and say that in this, we should understand that it is the work of all of us to carry on the work laid down by God in the incarnation. that cannot be overstated. It's not a matter of choice. It's a matter now for all of us of nature. So I'm going to open it up to questions. There is an infinite amount to say about the incarnation and what that draws us into in terms of mission. But you can see primarily that the Christian life is one of mission. It is quite literally an evangelical life. So we bear the gospel with us. We bear Christ in us. First, by virtue of our creation itself, and then more especially by virtue of our baptism. In our baptism, we were purified and entered truly into the life of Christ. And so now we're in a place where we have no choice but to let the light of Christ shine through us. This is something that is reflective of our entire movement across life towards God. And it relates intimately to the process of deification, of theosis, which, assuming we're all Orthodox Christians here, we should have been taught is our ultimate end. So beginning with St. Irenaeus as early as the 2nd century, the late 2nd century, he wrote in the preface to the 5th book of Against the Heresies, God became man in order that man might become God. That's a phrase you might have heard before, but it's a phrase that is then taken up by St. Athanasius in his great work on the Incarnation. And after that, it becomes a veritable leitmotif of Christian theology. We see it taken up most fully in the Greek theological tradition, the tradition that most intimately informs our Orthodox Christian worldview. But it in fact affects the Christian understanding of the world, East and West. And as a matter of trivia, perhaps for you, although it is not as fully worked out in the Latin West as it is in the Greek East, the prayer the priest offers traditionally in the Latin Mass, when he is pouring a bit of wine into the chalice before bearing the gifts to the altar, he says this prayer: O God, who didst create and yet more wonderfully renew the dignity of the substance of man, grant that by the mystery of this water and wine we may become partakers of his divinity, who didst vouchsafe to become a partaker of our humanity. Now, that is reflective of something that the theologian Norman Russell calls the exchange formula. God became man in order that man might become God. And in that, I'm showing with my hands, is the exchange. You can see how that becomes the seed for a fully worked out doctrine of deification. That is the process of our becoming like God. Now, there was one participant who had in fact signed up for today's session, but who has obviously and unfortunately been unable to join us. But I know that he has done a great deal of work on the Western lectionary. And in his work, he illustrates how the traditional Western lectionary reflects this idea of our ascent, that is, our human ascent to godliness, which is really quite wonderful because it does show sort of how the church prior to schism, in other words, when the church is simply Orthodox, it universally understands this process. But if we are called, and if we are recreated by virtue of our baptism, so that we become vessels of godliness, then doesn't that have immense implications for the world around us? It means, of course, that just as Christ healed, just as he undertook to touch the people around him, so too is it our responsibility. Of course, into this, we have to import will. So we, in many ways, do continue to exercise choice even post-baptism. And it's for that we have the sacrament of confession. Because how many of us, and I very much include myself in this, are faithful to the responsibility of both being deified and showing forth to the world the results of that process? Rather, is it not more probable that I, and possibly you, obviously I can't speak for everybody, but isn't it quite possible that I spend more time being distracted or failing in my pastoral duties to be out amongst God's beloved children, to show forth that light that he has lit, and which the Holy Spirit continually stirs within me? I think it's probably characteristic of all of us that we fail more often than we're successful, but that should not be indicative somehow of the acceptability of the situation. In other words, we must always seek to overcome, to advance in our own Christian life, and that very much includes manifesting the light of God in the world, or to the world around us. Now, how is this possible? When I began by talking about this exchange formula, this premise that God became man in order that man might become God, I often use a metaphor to illustrate it, and that is that of a climb. The Christian life is, from the moment of our baptism, inherently purgative. We Orthodox don't have a doctrine of purgatory, as the Latins do, that looks like some kind of geographical place. So if you think of Dante's Divine Comedy, where you've got the Inferno, or hell, and you've got Mount Purgatory, it serves to illustrate something profound and wonderful about the Christian life, but it can also cause us to misconstrue the process of purgation, which is in fact the process of deification, as something geographical. And so the Latins will talk about purgatory. Well, we don't. And there's very good reason for it. Because in fact, from the moment of our birth, and most particularly from the moment of our incorporation into the body of Christ, our whole life is purgative. And we represent that by our ascent up a mountain. If in that case, we picture God as the sun, we think of him as standing above the mountain. By making an ascent, we are in the continual process of moving towards God. But you might think to yourself, doesn't coming closer to the source of light and light itself entail getting burned? And indeed it can, but in this case, what the burning effects of the light are accomplishing in us is our purgation. So if you couple with this image of ascent, this image of climb up the mountain, another image, and that is of a pint glass of Guinness. Think of the pint glass and the opaqueness of the drink. As we drink, the glass becomes emptier and emptier. It becomes more and more transparent. That is akin to us being purged of the baggage we carry, of sin, of all the things that get in the way between usness and godness. And as we make our ascent up the mountain, that light to which we become closer day after day, ideally, is in fact burning off of us the contaminants, i.e. the sin. We are being continually purged. And another image I would use to illustrate that is if you imagine our mountain, now lay it flat so that it's two-dimensional and on the level. Growing up, we as a family used to travel from our home in Winnipeg, Canada, to visit my grandparents who had a home down in South Texas. And what I'm about to say is very literally true. When we would depart Winnipeg to go visit my grandparents, our vehicle would be caked in ice. It was often about the 15th or so of December. And when I say caked in ice, it's something that really only Nordic people can understand. I mean, literally, the body panels would have ice in a thin layer over them. The wheel wells would be absolutely full, to the point where if you went over a bump, the tires would scrape along the packed snow and ice that filled the wells. But we'd start out, and by the end of the first day of driving, get to South Dakota normally, if we were going straight down from where we lived. And the South Dakotan temperatures were not that far off what they were in Winnipeg, but it might be a few degrees warmer. By the end of the second day, we might get all the way to Kansas, South Kansas. And by then, the temperatures were significantly warmer. Over the course of driving south, with the increase in temperature, the ice would decrease. Now, we wouldn't have noticed it driving in the vehicle, but that would, of course, entail the vehicle becoming lighter, cleaner. By the time we'd get to North Texas, there would be no more snow. And by the time we arrived at my grandparents' place in South Texas, snow was a distant memory. Sounds an awful lot like the gradually emptying glass of Guinness. And better yet, sounds an awful lot like the gradual purgation of our very selves as we approach the source of all warmth and light. Returning to our glass of Guinness, what is significant about it is that by the time the glass is empty, it is still its own individual self, but it is entirely transparent to the light. It becomes a vessel of the light itself. Now, this is an incredible thing because the glass has its own individual identity, but the light shines through it perfectly, i.e., without contaminant, without any more opaqueness. Like St. John the Forerunner says, of himself, I must decrease in order that he might increase. The ego within us, which is so clouded by sin, decreases. We become less egotistical, less egocentric, in order that we might become Christocentric. And in us, people don't see ego then, but rather Christ himself. That is fundamentally evangelical. What is it but the bearing of the light to the world around us? I have a cupboard downstairs in my kitchen, which is full of our clear glasses. And before the cupboard is filled, it's burnt out quite some time ago, but there had been a light at the top of the cupboard which you could put on. And it was certainly visible. But how much more wonderful is it when the cupboard is filled with all the clear glasses, the light goes on and they become essentially diffusers of that light. So ultimately, we start by talking about Christ and how the incarnation is the template for mission. Then we talk about humanity, how it is that we become like Christ, and end with the idea that as we become what we are meant to be, God becomes all in all. Now, I've presented you with a whole series of sort of theological ideas. In telling you all of these things, I'm not expecting you to become sort of theologians in a formal academic sense. But even if you've picked up some idea of the excitement behind it, ultimately, that's what I want you to come away with. So regardless of the terms that we've just heard and the people to whom I've referred, I'm going to ask you now to take your microphones off, if you will, and just feel free to ask questions or make comments on anything that I've said.
In general, if I may.
Yes.
Are we basically saying that as we go throughout our life in terms of confession and the Eucharist, taking of the Eucharist, and we are striving to tackle our sin and so forth, that as we are doing that process, the people around us notice where's the balance of actually physically going out and speaking to others, or what's even harder, our family.
Yeah, that's in very practical terms what we're going to look at in the second half of this session. But as it relates directly to the theological sort of basis that I've just sought to describe, it's something that we cannot and should not avoid. And why I say that so boldly is that in the mission of the incarnation, if you remember seeing the icons unfold, those 6 icons unfold before us, is preaching, teaching, healing, and feeding. In other words, it really is a matter of inhabiting the world. In other words, none of the process I've just described is possible. Well, it's not impossible. We think about the examples of the great monastics, for example. But even they, quite rightly, would say monasticism isn't about retreat from the world. It's about taking on directly the demons that afflict us as we go about our lives in the world. Having said that, for those of us who are not in monasteries, our task there is different, and it must be to engage fully and truly with the world around us. You've probably heard, or I know that many people have heard in recent years, of this thing called the Benedict option. Now, I know it sort of gained a great deal of traction on Christian social media for a while. And if I understand it correctly, because I have to admit I haven't read the book, if I understand the Benedict option correctly, it's this idea that Saint Benedict, the great Western monastic, represented, of creating a community of prayer and of work while the world around him was essentially falling to pieces. And I guess one of the problems I have with this notion of the Benedict option today is that, first of all, it represents a kind of, it can possibly represent a kind of despair around the, as to the world around us. The fact is, I would argue, we inhabit and must inhabit the world, not as sons and daughters of the world, but as sojourners through it. And there is a purpose to our sojourn through it. So yes, it can be challenging, but we have to take it seriously. And if we think about St. Paul and the missions of the great apostle around the Eastern Mediterranean world, he undertook those missions with great confidence, with boldness, to the point where he waded into otherwise hostile territory. And far from shrinking, he saw what was there and Christianized it. Men and women of Athens, he said, I see that you have an altar to an unknown God. Let me tell you about that God. And St. Paul's example is an example that we must all hearken to. I am not suggesting that that one size fits all in terms of what that means for us. But I don't feel comfortable, for example, with condemnations of popular culture, not least because I think there can be great virtue in it. Take, for example, something that I remember seeing the first time and being somewhat turned off by, but upon reflection realized that there was immense potential in it. And that is a band you may have heard of from the 1980s called Guns N' Roses, and their song Paradise City. If you look at the video for that song, on one hand, it's quite grotesque, right? It's actually sort of a concert video in the sense that it's a presentation of the song in the context of them setting up for a performance. And over the course of the 4 minutes or whatever the song takes, you see images of what in 1980s North America we used to call headbangers, but you know, boys and girls kissing, and you know, imagery like that, that on video, such as it is, looks quite vulgar. But pan out for a moment, I suggest, and what you see is the longing of the soul for liturgy. The preparations behind the stage, the gathering of the people. Ultimately, when the performance begins, something like liturgy itself, where the singer acts like the high priest, and where the band members become servers of the altar. And what are the people doing in the crowd but undertaking ritual as they sort of nod their heads to the beat and feel a sense of ecstasy? And of course, that's not to ignore, if you like this sort of music, the virtuosity of Slash on guitar. Now, that might not be your thing, which is absolutely fine, but it casts a different light on what could, if you were to simply hear it on the radio or see it as it came up, as it used to in the 1980s on Canada's Much Music or MTV or whatever the channel was. You could be repelled by it and think, that's not very Christian. Well, no, not perhaps in a Nicene sense. But if human undertaking is actually a longing, an expression of longing for the light of God, then actually it's profoundly Christian. It's a reflection of the human desire for something beyond. And if we shut it out, we're not doing at all what St. Paul did in Athens. We're saying, when we see that altar to the unknown God, oh, that's a pagan thing, get it away from me. This was brought to mind to me by an Anglican priest who, when I was young, was a mentor to me. We had gone to an ice hockey game in Montreal together. We were watching the Canadiens play. If I remember correctly, it was the New Jersey Devils. And we had both admired the same player in our youth, a goalie for the Montreal Canadiens named Ken Dryden. None of this matters in terms of their details, but forgive me while I reminisce. And this priest was talking about the Christ-like virtue of the good play of that particular goalie. Now, that could sound scandalous, but in fact, awaken me to the idea that wherever there is beauty, virtue, goodness, excellence, what you are seeing or what you are experiencing is a pale icon of He who is all goodness, virtue, excellence, beauty, etc. So whether that's in sport or in music or in art, everything can become an indicator and an indicator of good things, an indicator of the transcendent, of that which lies beyond, and therefore a good seedbed for evangelism. Therefore, we can conclude, who would have ever thought that a good ice hockey match with its virtuosic players could somehow be the source for sharing the gospel? or a source for encountering, perhaps better phrased, a source for encountering the gospel. But if we have eyes to see and ears to hear, I think that it certainly can. Within that idea, then, there are gradations. So, you know, a Russian composer's Vespers is probably a lot closer in an obvious sense to our liturgical, to our theological, to our Christological aspirations than in Guns N' Roses concert. But actually, from somewhere along the continuum, I think that by virtue of the nature of human need and desire itself, they lead in the same direction. So the beginning of our practical evangelism can be to recognize this and therefore to engage fearlessly with the world around us and not run away from it. A final word on that, and I don't think, Carl, that I'm somehow exhaustively answering your question. I know that we will look at very practical undertakings in the second half. But I think I'll just offer this anecdote by way of closing off the first half, and then we can take a 5-minute break before coming back. And that is to say, many years ago, my parents were visiting my wife and I, where we were serving at that time in northern Saskatchewan. And I put a recording of Jimi Hendrix's performance of the Star Spangled Banner on the CD player, as it was then. And if any of you are familiar with that performance, it really is quite, I suppose, psychedelic. It's crazy, but it's also ingenious. And you just know that as Hendrix plays, especially then, but normally I think in his case, he's completely strung out. In other words, drugs have a huge effect on his experience and on his performance. Now, that in no way is a good thing, except that even in Hendrix's own brokenness, a brokenness reflected by the drug use, and which ends up in his own physical death, even in that brokenness, he's reaching out. And I always had a sense when I heard that, equally when I've listened to other artists like Lou Reed, for example, that in their own musings, whether by virtue of guitar or by lyric, in their own musings, on their own brokenness, they are simply expressing the human longing for something beyond, which ultimately suggests that far from needing to run away from the world, we should see the world as a place populated by beloved children of God who are all simply reaching out, hands up, in order that they might too see the light, imposing on each and every one of us who have been blessed with the knowledge, with the illumination that comes first through baptism and then through the process of deification, a necessity to share it.
If I may, are you saying trying to get people to understand or see that what they're trying to fill, that they're trying to fill something that as God's supposed to be filled by God, that we all have that longing in us, and we're all reaching out for various wrong things to fill that. If we can get them, direct them to see that, well, actually, this is what can fill that and bring you up to that level that we're all wanting to. get to. That's where we need to direct people towards, is that longing we all have. We all have that longing, and God is meant to fill that we all have that.
Absolutely. Yes. I would only condition your question with one word. You said reaching out to wrong things. I would say in some cases wrong things, and in some cases only the beginning of good things. Does that make sense? So the Lou Reeds of the world, who spent an awful lot of time using drugs, which ended up harming. Well, that's an example of the wrong things, certainly at the very least, the misdirected things. But in the music, however, not obviously sacred it was, there were also the beginnings of good things. So it's sort of a spectrum from the quite bad often to the beginnings of good. And our task then becomes to illumine it all so that the bad is burnt away, going back to the, and the good is further and further and further illumined. Not unlike a music teacher who might be working with a child who likes the music that mom and dad have played for him or her, and then showing how wonderful music can be, and drawing that child deeper and deeper into a world of rich music, so that perhaps when the child then first steps into a divine liturgy and hears Byzantine chant, he recognizes it as a fuller and more splendid form of everything else he's ever heard. And when he arrives at that point, he can actually then swing back and forth, recognizing that in the the poetry of Leonard Cohen or whoever, and in the chants of the people on the kleros, there is there is a relationship. So it's about illumining, burning away the bad by virtue of simply the brightness of our life, or the brightness of God's light in us, and illumining the beginnings of the good that they see. And that's where the St. Paul example of the altar in Athens, the altar to the unknown God, comes in, right? He didn't see in that something to run away from. He saw in that something to be further illumined, so that the people through it would come to know the God whose name they prior to that moment did not know. So that's the condition. The short answer, though, to your question is absolutely. You're right.
So I know I'm probably jumping into the second hour. So with regards to a family that's Protestant, in pretty much in all of it, for me anyway, not necessarily pointing out that you're doing this and this and all this wrong, but actually you just need to go more. You're there, you need to go more, go further. And this is, of course, in Orthodoxy, it's not that you're doing all these things wrong, but actually you need to go further.
Absolutely. Because let's start. If you've got a Protestant family, if any of us are, have relationships, which inevitably we will, because assuming that we all live in the UK, but whether or not that's true is beside the point. We don't live in an overwhelmingly Orthodox society, do we? And so we look around at other Christian friends or family and we say, well, where should we start? Should we start by showing them where they're wrong? Or should we start by recognizing, that they actually believe in a transcendent? And that it's not just a vague transcendent, but a transcendent which is in fact a person in three persons. So they already have an understanding of the Holy Trinity, which means inherently that they have the beginnings of an understanding of the person of God as love, because the Trinity is inherently loving. They already understand the idea that he is so loving that he condescends to become one of us in Christ. And so however much the doctrine that they hold may not be perfect, may not have been cast in the light that Orthodoxy possesses because of its continuity with the church as it was first established, it's still there. The seeds are there. And so it's a matter of affirming that which can be affirmed, lovingly correcting that which can stand correction, which is done primarily, I would say, by being love ourselves, as opposed to figures of argument, and engaging by means of argument in the true sense of that word with, points that need correction, but ultimately by showing, both by life and by word, a consistency between that which we profess by our attendance at liturgy, our participation in the body of Christ, with the way we live our lives and with the way we speak our words, so that it all just becomes much of a oneness. An error so many of us make is in taking a posture of not opposition so much, a posture of okay, I'll say conflict, but for lack of a better term right now, a posture of conflict. This idea that it's us versus them, because it's not. It's us and them, all of us being children of God. The only difference being that within the family of Orthodoxy and standing within a tradition, we can be confident of the joy, confident in the joy that comes with being part of that thing that is so much bigger than us. And if we actually have that confidence, then knowing we have nothing to fear by being with others, because it should shine so brightly through us that others become illumined by it.
Could I come back to a point that was maybe you were making, which was a very good point, that in other people's lives and culture, there's much good that can be affirmed. But there's also a danger in that I think C.S. Lewis brings it out in The Great Divorce, one of my favorite books, that the good in a person's life, because it is good and God-given, can become the idol that prevents us going on to the Lord. I mean, the Lord did say that we have to deny husband, wife, etc., etc. And I've known a situation where people who getting interested in Christianity and then falling in love with somebody, and then, they've settled for that, at least for a time, rather than going forward.
Thank you for that.
God.
Because what you're saying in making that comment is of immense importance. You're quite right. An analogy I might, because I've been talking so much about music, I might as well continue with it. A good analogy for that would be, my brother is a professional musician, and he always gets very impatient with what I know Aidan Hart, the iconographer, wonderfully calls threshold art. In other words, things that in their positive sense can serve to draw you more deeply in, or as Lewis says, higher up and further in, but often don't, because people get stuck on them. So take, for example, a radio station that was popular where and when I was growing up, that was kind of a popular station on in every genre. So if you wanted to be introduced to classical music, country music, folk music, pop music, they played a light form of it all. but it would be, and this is what my brother would argue, stuff like that can actually become an end point for someone, thinking somehow that because they heard, a light opera piece on that radio station, that they know about opera and they love it. But actually all they heard was the most popular single piece ever. Or, a person thinking that somehow they know about and love classical music because they hear Pachelbel's canon and can whistle it because it's ubiquitous. You're absolutely right. And the same thing can happen spiritually. If we are affirmed in and affirm the goodness of romantic love, then our romantic love becomes our endpoint as opposed to a means. I would go so far as to say that can equally apply to even elements of the church. People who become liturgical obsessives can become fixated on the liturgy to the point where the liturgy becomes an end in itself, as opposed to the organic living out of the fullness of our faith. Equally, the canons, that's not canonical. This is not canonical. The canons are means to an end. They're tools to assist us in our perfection, and not at all a means to, not at all an end in themselves. So that danger actually is something, and I really appreciate what you've said because of the fact that it's alerted us to it. But that danger actually lies scattered all over the field. And as we progress, as we help others progress, we need to continually urge each other on, lest we become fixated on that point, on some distracting point, and turn that point into an idol in itself. I think probably the solution to that is it lies in the fact that we are members of the ecclesia, the gathered community. To be a part of the church and to be an evangelist, which is to belong to the church, to belong to the body of Christ, is not to be alone. And because we aren't alone, then taking up our communal responsibility seriously by urging each other on when we notice each other becoming fixated on a certain point. Think Lord of the Rings, when even the slightly ambiguous in terms of his character Gollum actually assists the hobbits in staying on the path and not falling off into I can't remember what it's called, but the marsh where the ghosts inhabit. The fact is that it's by undertaking all of this together that we actually enable an overcoming of idolatry, because we point out to one another, hopefully in charity, be careful there, lest we turn it into an end in itself. Can I suggest, just so we can take a comfort break and get a glass of water, that it's on my computer 13 past. Let's pretend it's quarter past and say a 5-minute break, and then we will regather and continue with the second half. Okay.
Okay.
See you shortly. On that note, I'm going to bring up now for the second half the slides that I had shared with you earlier, but we're going to move on to a couple of further slides that represent essentially just a list. We're now going to move into the practical outcomes, or the practical outcomes incumbent on us to undertake. The first thing I would say is that when engaging in mission, we need confidence. And it's a type of confidence that relates very much to what we were talking about initially. Confidence that is reflected in St. Paul. The confidence of not retreating from the world, but rather going into the world and knowing that it's all okay. That with confidence, then we can become personally visible and active. That is hugely important. I'm going to say more about that in a moment. It requires visiting people, and this is directed particularly at clergy, but it very much includes all of us. Offering the services with devotion. Now, again, that might seem as if it applies particularly to clergy, but involves all of us. And ultimately reading and teaching. Communicating internally and externally. So what do I mean by these things? Well, confidence we've already talked about, but being personally visible and active is something that requires a further word, I think. Now, Peter, because I've just learned that he had been an Anglican priest, will perhaps know what I mean when I talk about the problem in the church as a whole of the priest mistaking his desk as the field of mission. I know that when I served as an Anglican priest, not so much in Canada, but once I moved over to the Church of England and continued that ministry in my case, Manchester, there was an unspeakable amount of admin involved, whether that was dealing with local funeral homes and the subsequent paperwork that came with undertaking that kind of public work, or whether that was dealing with the sort of centrally administered matrimonial rules and various things like it. It was, and creating the news sheet for the Sunday service, etc. It was all incredibly isolating. And I think it's really easy for us to confuse work that we're doing from our desks with the actual work of the church. When we Christians are confronted with the need to evangelize, whether that's because somebody has asked, what are we going to do about the fact that we don't get as many people to liturgy on Sunday as we used to in the olden days, or whether that's because we've been motivated for some emotional reason to want to share, oftentimes I think our first thoughts take us to our laptops. What can I create? What can I do here? What admin do I have to undertake in order to make this or that happen? When in fact, going back to our conversation around the incarnation, we have to account for the fact that the church is planted and first begins to grow because the incarnate Word of God goes for a walk. I could leave this presentation there and consider myself to have said enough. The entire gospel is based on our Lord going for a walk. The first we encounter him after his childhood, getting separated from his parents in Jerusalem, is of walking down to the Jordan to be baptized, thereafter walking into the desert, thereafter walking around the holy places, which we now recognize as such, and talking to people. Nothing else happens. There is no admin involved. There is no mass media campaign. There is no access to social media. It is about interpersonal encounter. And if we, whatever our ministry, wherever we find ourselves, limit ourselves to the desk, the light of Christ, as it has been lit in us, inflamed in us by the Holy Spirit, and is incumbent on us to share, goes no further than our computer screens. So alongside this then is visiting the people. And one of the things I'm most grateful for as a former Anglican priest is the formation I had in pastoral care. Again, this might seem to apply particularly to clergy, but I think belongs to all of us. One of the things I was given when I was ordained deacon was a copy of Bishop Edward King's pastoral lectures, which he gave at Oxford in the early 20th century. And if I were to sum up these pastoral lectures, it would be to say that Edward King encourages in his listeners the awareness of a responsibility that if your parishioner is sick, no matter what time of day you visit, end of story. Visit. Now, that might entail sitting down with people and having a cup of tea in the afternoon and feeling as if no fruit can possibly be born from such activity. But, and I'm not saying it is the begin-all end-all, because true evangelism requires a lot of things, some of which are reflected in front of you, but visiting is part of it, because it means encountering those who are already moving in the church's direction in the midst of their lives. And this is quite naturally coherent with the walking that I've already talked about, going out and meeting people where they are at. Bringing it into the church, this must have the outcome of serving the liturgy we serve with devotion. We cannot confuse devotion with fussiness. Because as a cradle Anglican, I grew up in an Anglo-Catholic setting. Serving with devotion could sometimes be misinterpreted, not so much in my own background, but according to things I witnessed, with the length of lace on a priest's alb, or whether or not that priest preferred to serve in Roman vestments as opposed to Gothic vestments, or whatever. All of that is in some ways frivolity. It is as nothing. Of course, we must vest according to the church's traditions. End of. I am actually quite militantly against breaches of rubric, but those, as Peter had warned us against earlier, turning means into ends, or small things into idols. We cannot turn vestments, we cannot turn rubrics into idols. They are guides in order to make the ends possible. And the services of the church are the closest thing to an end goal that we have in this world. They lead us to the liturgy of heaven. And so when they are manifest, when they are lived out, they must be lived out with as much care and love as possible. Reading and teaching. We began, when we came back from the break, talking very briefly about books. Those are important. And I would say books, engagement, all together are important. So I used a lot of musical examples in the first half of this presentation, but actually, you know, when I sit here and I'm writing or, you know, creating some kind of advertisement or whatever, I've often got music on in the background. When I'm not listening to music, then I am reading. If I'm not reading, and for example, I'm walking to my child's school to pick him up from, you know, at the end of the day, I've got some kind of hopefully edifying podcast in my ears, or else I'm simply meditating on the things I see as I walk down the pavement. But it's about taking things in. It's about taking things in so that there is a fire within us that we are continually fueling. Because the next half of this dimension to practical evangelism, that is teaching, is impossible to undertake unless we have something to teach in the first place. We've got nothing to share if we've been putting nothing in, if we've been taking nothing in. So reading and teaching. Now, teaching will mean something different to each of us, because some of us have a particular vocation to teach in the way that St. Paul described different members of Christ's body having different functions. But there's also the general teaching that we undertake, the gentle conversations we have with loved ones, with colleagues, with friends, even with fellow Orthodox Christians who may not have the same awareness of certain things that we have at exactly the same time as we may not have the same awareness of certain things as they have. So it's about exchange, continual exchange. We must be taking in and we must be putting out. Again, drawing on my Anglican formation, this is something impressed upon us in the ordinal of the Book of Common Prayer, wherein we are implored to continually be studious in the scriptures. Continual study is something I cannot remember if Bishop Edward King mentions or not, but is something that certainly if he did, and I'm sure he would have, is something intrinsic to, I think, good Christian ministry. And one does not have to be an academic theologian by any stretch of the imagination, but one does have to be engaged. I'm reading a novel right now, which I find, although clearly not explicitly Christian in any conventional sense, is certainly inspiring and gives rise to all sorts of thoughts that actually expand my vision of what I might be doing by way of Christian ministry. Finally, at least for this slide, is the idea of communicating internally and externally. And what I mean by that, I'll begin by describing the first half internally, is making sure that everybody within the Christian community, i.e. our local parishes, everybody is on the same page. That's a hard one. I find that exceptionally hard because I'm not naturally given to good admin. And sometimes good admin facilitates internal communication. But fortunately, where I am weak, others in my community are strong. And so messages do get out there. We have a WhatsApp group, which does help. Because it means there's a one-stop shop for getting a message out. But unless people know about feasts during the week, they can't possibly acknowledge them. It's as simple as that. I know that cathedrals and large parishes where you've got a network of people undertaking the different tasks do this well, where the Orthodox tradition has been strong for a long time. People might already know about things like feasts in midweek, but where we are in a mission situation, as is the case here in Cardiff, Wales, it's not so natural and it's not so easy. So keeping lines of communication open between us all is very, very important, because it's like weaving a tighter web, and the tighter the web, the more solid it is as a basis from which people that inhabit that plane can grow. Communicating externally will lead us into the next slide, but that has to do with letting the world know what we are doing. Letting the world know what we are doing. That's different than teaching and the public proclamation of the gospel. I'm just talking about letting people know that our communities exist. Letting our people know, or letting the people around us, I should say, know what time the doors open. Letting people know that they can come in. Letting people know that we're entirely open to them, and that they should feel free to ask us questions of any sort, because we are not shut off. It is not a betrayal of the mystery, as we say in the prayer before we come forward for communion. I will not betray the mystery, as did Judas with a kiss. It is not a betrayal of the mystery to say that the world is invited to behold what we do. It is rather a betrayal to participate in that mystery and then fail to share it in the sense of proclamation. So communicating is what leads us into various outreach ideas. And these I'm just going to roll out quickly and then take it off the slide presentation so that we can talk about them. But in the first case, I am a huge proponent of something that here I'm calling mission walks, but which I instituted in Cardiff last year, calling my cassock walks. Now, what are these? These are easier to undertake when you literally wear a cassock, because you have that visual signal to the world as you walk down the pavement in your own or on your own body. But it was in light of my realization that we spend far too much time at our desks that caused me to reflect on responses I get when I do walk down the street in my cassock, which happens fairly frequently. And the idea that that could actually be made more common just by me going out for regular walks in the neighborhood. And so I started, and I've got to confess to having let the ball drop on that one, although that does not in any way suggest a lack of importance on its part. But donning a cassock, in other words, simply dressing as the priest that I am and have been called to be, and letting the world know that that is not at all strange, is something that has ultimately invited a great deal of conversation and some wonderful interactions on the street. Where I live in Cardiff, I have a very wealthy end of my neighborhood on one side, and equidistant to me on the other side is an extremely socially deprived area. And I can walk the streets of that neighborhood and encounter everyone from one of many local drug addicts to any number of inhabitants of multi-million pound homes, and both, I think, deserve to be met. It involves me simply going out and walking with no other objective in mind than to be seen and to be available to anyone that might want to have a chat while I walk down the street. What emboldens me in this outreach idea is really twofold. The first is based on the fact that Cardiff has an historic Somali Muslim community. And despite the fact that the Somali Muslim community has been here for pretty much 100+ years, due to the docks and the fact that they first came to work on the docks, they have maintained cultural dress. I don't know what percentage of Cardiff's population is Muslim, but I do know that, especially in certain neighborhoods such as Grangetown and Riverside, as well as the old docks, you can go, or you can hardly go, I should say, 50 meters without seeing a man in one of the crocheted caps, very similar to our own scufias, and a long robe or shirt. And I have to be forgiven for not knowing what the names of these various garments are. But why is it, I began to wonder, that they, whose history in the country goes back 100 or so years, feel as confident as they do to reflect their faith and their culture in the way they dress, when we Christians have been here for 1700 years, and the examples of our saints are such that they themselves might have even been seen as crazy in their time, yet we demur, we hold back from manifesting our faith through clothing, through our appearance, but ultimately setting appearance aside, just on a public basis, full stop. Why we hold back from that is beyond me. And so I got to thinking that actually it's necessary. My cassock is not a source of pride, nor is it a source of embarrassment. It's simply a sign of the fact that I hope I walk in the steps of my Christian forebears, who themselves were likely seen at times as clowns, as living on the periphery of society, yet as also inhabiting that society, and as moving about in it, representing the light of Christ. Social media street engagement. This has come up only recently, in fact, because I am chaplain at Cardiff University. It gives me access to a lot of people, but not as parish priest. I have access to those people as a pastor that has a general responsibility to the whole university community. Yet last week, this whole past week, I should say, because it has been freshers, it means that there have been literally tens of thousands of additional people around the city center of Cardiff and around the streets that make up the university. And I couldn't use that opportunity to evangelize in an overt way, because that's not my task as chaplain. But there was nothing to stop my parishioners from engaging, and so they in fact tried. In order to do this, we created forms of information that they could use to distribute, but I'll come to that in a few moments. The biggest result of the efforts that unfolded this past week on the pavements in the region around the university was precisely what we were doing wrong. And what we were doing wrong was not having a hook. The fact is, nobody is impressed when we try to engage with the broader population in questions of faith by somebody who shouts on a street corner. In fact, not only is it off-putting, I think it can come across as borderline diabolical. And if we don't believe in any form of coercion, which I would say we must certainly not, then we have to have a way of opening up a conversation that is transparent, open, honest, and yet still allows us to open up that conversation in the first place. So how do you strike that balance? You strike it by having a positive hook, one that people can reject if they wish, but equally makes it clear that there is a conversation of interest to be had. So we talked then, myself and particularly one parishioner who engaged in the efforts this past week, about how that might be done. We see or hear a lot, if we don't actually use it ourselves, about Instagram reels and TikTok videos and YouTube interviews and such things. And because the younger members of my own community have some facility in creating such forms, we came upon the idea of doing essentially street interviews, so that they and I, if I get involved in this particular activity, might, with a camera and a microphone, go up to people and say, do you have a moment to talk about, and then have a question ready so that they can say yes or no. And if they say, yeah, that sounds interesting, we can use the basis of a 5-minute recorded conversation as one that has two possible effects. The first is that it means we've engaged with the person on a personal level, full stop, meaning that person who might not have had a conversation with a Christian before has now had one. And then, secondly, the results of the conversation can be put, obviously with their permission, on social media platforms so that others might view it. So that's what I mean by social media street engagement, meaning going out into the public, in this case, using social media as a hook, and opening up spiritual conversations with people. Social media itself, that is, using it for whatever good it proffers. In this respect, and I don't mind saying, because if this presentation can be edited well enough, it will go out into the public domain. But I have had a love-hate relationship with social media. I have used it to my own detriment before, and to the detriment of others. I've repented of that and stepped far back from it, but still found it a somewhat addictive tool. Recently, however, I have found what I hope to be a good balance, meaning I use it to, by going on, communicating a specific message, and by getting off. In other words, logging out and not revisiting it until the next day. So no longer do I use any form of social media as a way of engaging with the rather mundane, sometimes incredibly destructive conversations, even if they're ostensibly Christian. Rather, I go on, I sort of drop the message by putting up an advertisement for some kind of thing that I might be doing, including this very session we're having today. But then I back off and just leave it out there. So social media, we will all have ways of using it, or we may have all different ways of using it. As long as we retain a sense of the need for spiritual health in the midst of using it, I think it can be used for good. This one, mundane as it seems, is so important. I have driven past church after church, temple after temple, that says A, either nothing about itself, or B, says something, but in a mid 20th century fashion, meaning, and I'll use a local Protestant example. Signage says, minister, the Reverend so and so, with their degrees, and the time of service, and the denomination name. And I think, how is that affecting anyone? Even if it's noticed, it is communicating a message that is now, say, 80 years old at least. And it's simply not good enough. Equally, I think the signs outside of other Christian communities that are, very, I'll say glitzy, but almost London West End-ish in their nature, are possibly overdoing it and not, again, conveying something faithful, but rather, something that is much more ego-centered. Signage, though, remains important. So how do we use it? I'm not saying that I've come up with the perfect formula. I am going to say, though, that what we've done where we are has proven effective, at least so far. That is, we are privileged here in Cardiff to use a Methodist church as our home. The Methodists, in their breathtaking generosity, and I'm not saying that with a view to making potential Methodist listeners just feel good, I'm saying it because it's true, have allowed us to use their building to erect an iconostas in an empty transept, and to make it our home base almost without restriction. And part of that has been to allow us, on the outside of the church, where you've got a brick wall with rails above it running around a street corner in a prominent part of the city, to put up very large vinyl banners, which were easily acquired from Vistaprint, although of course there are other printers available, that simply says, in huge letters, the Orthodox Church, and then in smaller letters, meets here Sundays at. And then, because our time has changed a few times, I actually use an outdoor sticker or a decal to put on the vinyl banner, so that I don't have to replace the banner every time the time changes, stating the time. And for us now, that means 12:30. But I've been told by numerous people that they know about our parish because, oh, that's the Orthodox Church on that corner. Furthermore, I have at least one parishioner whom I have had the privilege of baptizing and chrismating, who walked through our door because he'd been walking by on a daily basis, noticed the signs, and on that particular day had seen the door open. Signage, effective signage that's being properly thought through, can be a real boon to communicating the message of openness, and the idea that in that openness we have content worth knowing about. Do not underestimate the power of literature. When we revert to talking face to face instead of with the slide presentation on, I'll show you an example of a pamphlet that we've created. This has been of great importance because in a world where we are surrounded by digital messaging through social media, through any use of the internet, through our smart television screens and through our phones, literature still means something. I can reflect historically on my experience as a boy, where at the back of our parish church, we had a tract rack, and where I would pick up those tracts and take them home. Now, I might have been a bit strange insofar as I probably always had a religious bent, but I devoured that stuff. And I'm not saying that literature works in the same way today, but I'm saying that surely there are still people out there who, over a cup of coffee, don't want to turn their phones on, but rather will be quite happy to look at an interesting looking piece of paper that has a short, concise message that they can digest while they relax. There are different forms of literature. We can talk about those practically in a moment, but producing good literature, and I'm not talking about books, I'm talking here about simple paper products that people can ingest fairly quickly and that represents something of interest to them. Information venues. I'm talking here about putting up booths. Some of us live in places where there are village markets. Some of us may not, but where we have access to public walkways, and just standing out there and being present can be of immense value. But it's not a matter, again, of getting into people's faces, but putting up an attractive stand of some sort that invites people to come forward and engage us in conversation. A church open house. We go about our lives of worship often without wondering why other people aren't interested in joining us. Think about how intimidating it is to look at a place of worship, especially when you and perhaps even your ancestors have been divorced from any sense of religious practice for 100 years, and it will be that by now. Would you walk into a Buddhist temple just because somebody, just because you knew that they were open at 10 o'clock on a certain day of the week? The likelihood is no. Would you walk into a mosque? Probably no. You might have some sense that you've heard somewhere that a Muslim, when he goes into a mosque, takes his shoes off. But what do you know about their practice? Will you be sort of overwhelmed by people attacking you to become Muslim immediately upon entering in? I can tell you the answer to that question is no, you won't be. But I can also say that if you and I would feel intimidated by going into other people's places of worship, what is it like for them approaching an Orthodox church? I think we know the answer to that. It will seem intimidating at the very least. So opening up our doors, making it public that they will be greeted, enable the chance to find out more about what on earth is going on inside, with no other commitment than perhaps drinking the coffee we thrust into their hand that day or eating a biscuit, can go a long way. Public lectures. Now, this is not something that everybody would necessarily feel comfortable unless you can get a speaker to come and then advertise it. Advertise it in the community as a free public lecture or a lecture with a retiring collection. I think people like a sense of ownership over what they undertake. So a collection is no bad thing, as long as people are not forced to give money and they don't see it as some kind of coercive fundraiser. Or but a public lecture, that you find a speaker from within your own community or from somewhere else who would be willing to come and deliver a talk, and open the doors. Drum up support for it simply by going out and saying, on Thursday night in late November, before the Christmas shopping rush or shopping fever hits us, come find out what a traditional Christian take on this whole business is. You're not going to get thousands of people rushing to the door, but you might get 50. And it might be their first time in an Orthodox church. You can use your building as a venue. And there is nothing wrong with holding a lecture, so to speak, in the nave of a temple. Quite the opposite, I think. Or it could be somewhere else. There might be a more specific venue that you have access to, a community hall, or even if you have a university association or can find somebody who does, a university lecture hall that they're willing to let out for free. Either way, there was a day and age where public lectures were common, and they could be on the topic of physics, or they could be on the topic of in the early 20th century of spiritualism. Well, if you can have such a wide range, why not theology? Why not Christian thought? Why not history? Why not something that gives people greater insight into our lives as Christians? I'm a huge proponent of the public lecture. And that might sound daunting, but I think it's something that actually we can certainly facilitate in our communities, even if we ourselves aren't the ones delivering. So, before I close off the presentation, potential pitfalls. Nothing about evangelism works unless we account for potential pitfalls. Peter has already drawn our attention to one, and that is that of potential idolatry. But I would say equally today, and actually this probably relates to what we spoke about regarding idolatry, but that is particularly pressing as an issue, which is contaminating the message with our own biases. Politics, I mentioned, conspiracies, polemics. Look at the social media Orthodox scene and despair. People can, American, and obviously they're not the only ones guilty, but it is particularly pronounced there. American Orthodox Christians who confuse Christian Orthodoxy with voting Republican. I'm making that up, by the way. It's probably got truth to it, but I don't mean that as an only example. Conspiracies, relating orthodoxy to whether or not you accept the vaccine, the COVID vaccine when it was a thing, the closing of churches being a government plot to undermine Christianity. By all means, if we have concerns about these things that are genuine, then we should be conversing about them. I don't think that there should be no-go areas. I don't think that our evangelical message should be contaminated by any such thoughts or conversations. Failing to stay intellectually engaged relates to what I said earlier about reading and teaching. I repeat it here, we have nothing to come out when there's nothing going in. We have to be reading, we have to be engaging in earnest conversation, we have to be engaged in art, we have to be willing to we have to be willing to engage with facets of popular culture that might not be intellectually stimulating, but if we're also staying intellectually engaged, then we can process popular culture in a way that is potentially very fruitful. I could not leave this behind without saying that not praying is a potential pitfall, unless everything we do is absolutely grounded in prayer, both personal and most especially the prayer life of the church. Then it is all for naught. There is no link between what we are purporting to do and the end goal of that activity, unless that link is prayer. Of course, there is the potential to act like Congregationalists, thinking that evangelism is just about getting people into our specific church. We have to recognize that we're part of a wider church, a jurisdiction, a diocese. There are lots of facets to the bigger community to which we belong, but we have to be thinking, when we talk evangelically, about something much bigger than our local parish community. If a person, by means of our witness, becomes attracted to our local community, then that's just a side blessing. I mention here emphasizing only one aspect of our mission. I use liturgy as an example. That kind of relates to what I said about idolizing or fetishizing even a specific way of doing liturgy. Liturgy must be faithful and devout, no question. But liturgy cannot be an end in itself. And that's what happens if we emphasize only one aspect. You can see that in certain Protestant communities, especially. Mind you, I should revise that and say probably a lot of communities, particularly alongside Protestants, Catholics, that emphasize the social mission of the church. Fundraising for this tsunami, getting blankets to refugees, these are all good things. But it is so easy to forget that they are only ever one part of a whole. Finally, being sheepish about who we are and what we are, that is, hiding our light. Just as we see our Muslim neighbors in our various towns, and of course other religious as well, but I say Muslims because they are quite visible. We have no need to be just as they are quite confident in manifesting their religion and their culture in the way they dress, so might we be, because we have nothing to be ashamed of. In terms of heritage, we have 1,700 years in these islands alone. In terms of content of that heritage, we have Christ present with us and the Holy Spirit ever working in us and on our side, and we have nothing to fear. With that, I come back to you. I'm conscious of the fact that that went on longer than expected, but as long as you're able and willing to carry on the conversation for at least a few more minutes, we might wrap it up with words from you. If you do have to go, I also entirely understand. But if okay, why don't I ask you to take your microphones off and feel free to leap in with either questions or points.
I do have a question. It's probably the most trivial.
Yep.
Mention walks. That's something that it's been heavy on my heart to do, and I've been starting to do, even though I got a bad foot. As a layman, what does that realistically look like in terms of trying to, I don't know, portray that we're different and be noticed? If you talk about the Muslims, that's obvious. They wear it on themselves. But I appreciate I've got a long beard and everything, but I mean, what does that look like as for a layman?
That's a wonderful question, and one that I've been asked literally here as well, because of my support of them, yet the fact that I have a distinct advantage. I think, I mean, one thing that does impress, and it's not de fide, it is not absolutely central to, you know, the Orthodox life and faith, is the way we look. You know, I'm conscious, and I say this with a smile on my face, because Peter doesn't have a beard, but the fact is, you know, a lot of Orthodox men do. That I know in conversation with Muslims in this community, it has actually been a point of contact. A dear friend of mine who's Greek Orthodox in the United States, but who had lived here for a long time, was passing through Birmingham New Street station one day, and one of the platform guards, who was obviously a Muslim, had a big beard on. And so this friend of mine, who passed him on the platform, stopped, and he said, "Hey man, love your beard." And of course he himself had a beard, and so the two of them had an exchange that was really very friendly. But it was entirely because they could recognize in each other a certain outward religiosity, and hopefully, obviously, that is an outward and visible sign of something deeply inward. But that is just a thing. Wearing a cross, wearing an icon, something that reflects to others. But I think conveying a sense of love as we walk down the street helps. Now, what does that look like? We all have different personalities, so we're going to approach this differently. But as I'm talking to you, and I don't just mean you, Carl, but all three of you, Benedict, Peter, and Carl, I can see that you're all sort of smiling, right? You're conveying a sense of warmth. I walk down the street, and I used to be an avid cyclist until a brick wall brought that career to an end. But the fact is, even when I was on my bicycle, because you pass pedestrians, you smile, you nod, you say good day, you be attentive to other people's needs as you walk down the pavement. The young mother who's pushing a child in a pram and faces a square curb as they cross the street, who gets a quick lift. Nothing need be said, but you say, you know, you do that with warmth in your eyes, and you've already conveyed a message. You do that with warmth in your eyes and a cross that happens to be dangling or falling out of your shirt as it dangles on its chain, plants a seed that that person who just helped me was a person of faith. It leads to a discussion outside of the park entrance where you've, you know, stopped to get a coffee, and suddenly another conversation is opened up. These are only little things, and I realize that they're still not as obvious as the cassock, but they're not nothing, and they shouldn't be undervalued. But having said all of that, at university, and I don't tend to wear one because I'm almost always in my cassock, but on the rare occasion when I have to do something at the university that doesn't involve me wearing my cassock and my pectoral cross, we chaplains all have our respective chaplaincy hoodies. Now, the chaplaincy hoodie that I have, which on the back of all of ours just says Cardiff University Chaplain, mine has a huge 3-bar cross on it. It costs almost not a penny more than buying a regular hoodie to go on and have a custom one printed for yourself online. And what you could do, this might sound really naff to some ears, and I accept that, but there may be people who are comfortable with it. Get yourself a hoodie that just has a nice embroidered 3-bar cross on it, and walk down the street. You know, purposely say, today or this week I'm going to do 3 one-hour walks on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, wearing this hoodie. And that's all I'm going to do. Maybe you put your parish name on the back of it or something. It doesn't matter. As crazy as some of that sounds, because clothing doesn't tend to be the marker for affiliation anymore, well, then we come up with something that does. And it's there, it becomes a matter of what we're comfortable with, as long as it's not something that transgresses our local parish rules. Like, you wouldn't want to get an icon of the Holy Theotokos on your chest, because guess what? Not appropriate. But something that is appropriate and adheres to tradition and whatever. I think as long as you're comfortable doing it, go for it. Because anything that opens up a conversation, together with the content of our faith that we convey by means of our behavior, is going to be good. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can remember a walk. Well, I haven't done many because I'm dealing with a foot problem, but I can remember a walk where I'm very conscious of smiling. I'm very conscious. I've noticed that when you smile, all of a sudden the other person's face will light up if they see you. And sometimes that's all it takes. With one person I ended up running into in the town center, we just ended up in a 10-minute conversation about America, where I'm obviously from. Been here 20 years, but in the UK. But he just wanted to talk and talk and talk, and I was just thinking, this isn't going anywhere spiritually. How can I even? And it never went anywhere spiritually. I thought, when I walked away from it, well, maybe he just was happy enough to unload and to talk, and but I just sometimes got frustrated by the lack of sort of going in a direction that would be helpful spiritually. But
I think in that respect, we can have faith that conversations like that can be used by God, regardless of explicit content. And so we just offer it up as we walk away. In other words, when the conversation is over, we just thank God for it and offer it up and say, God, use this one. That is, that's, something that can be of intrinsic value. But yes, I totally sympathize with the idea that you want to, somehow steer things towards greater content or more explicit content. I mentioned printed literature. I'm going to show you something that I've been a bit cheeky around my neighborhood, because I keep dropping them in bus stop, like bus shelters. There's a book niche at the corner of one of our streets nearby. It's sort of one of these free libraries where people just put their red paperbacks, and other people. I will go over to them when I'm passing by, and I've had bookmarks made with the parish information on it. And then it's got our service times.
Yes.
And on the back is just an Orthodox cross with a QR code. Now, I will go over to the local sort of free library in that niche along the roadside, and I'll stuff all of the books full of these things, so that somebody takes them home, and they think they're getting John Grisham, but they're getting St. Peter and St. Tylo as well. My kids laugh at me because I'll leave them on bus seats if I take the bus anywhere or whatever. And I've even asked at my local, because they know who I am, if I can leave them a batch and just put them on the bar. And could be that nobody takes them. It could be that they just end up getting used as coasters. But it's out there. It's just this continual messaging. I grew up in the 1970s and 80s in Canada, and I think I remember every single television advertisement jingle I ever heard, and much to both the chagrin and bemusement of my family. But I mention that because that advertising was effective due to repetition. And we have a message, the first element of which is that we're living. In other words, we're alive. Our parishes, our communities actually have names. And if the first thing we do is just put the name into people's minds, and they see it because they were at the pub last night and it was on the counter, or they were walking past the bus shelter, or they took the bus and realized that some cheeky wag left some bookmarks on every seat, or whatever, it just keeps planting the seed, right? And I have found this, my own parishioners have said to me, oh, I met somebody who knew exactly what church I went to because they've seen the sign, or they picked up a bookmark on the bus. And I just smile inwardly, because we've got to rebuild an infrastructure of connections that has ultimately dissolved over the last 500 years at least, right? And we can only do that by being a little bit sometimes subversive and sometimes just overt. But if we carry these equally, just having a calling card, this is just my normal card, but just having a card that perhaps has a cross on it with our parish name or something like that, anything. So when we're talking to somebody, it's been a delight talking to you. You might be interested in this. Have a blessed day. That's it, right? So these are ways of overcoming a lack of, otherwise obvious markers.
Yeah,
Ultimately, when I talked about literature, this is the pamphlet I had made. 3 short paragraphs with images and the parish contact information. And I was thinking about rolling this out because I've got the template already. I've designed it and made it to every Orthodox parish in the country, because there's no sense everybody reinventing the wheel. The text is already there. I just have to, instead of putting St. Theodore and St. Tylo on it, put St. Nicholas Oxford on it, or St. Anne's Northampton on it, or whatever. And then everybody can have them. It's a small monetary investment, but it's worth it, because you can have a nice conversation with somebody, but it can go up in smoke the moment you walk away from them because we get distracted. But give them a substantial, this is nice and glossy and on good quality paper, give them a substantial thing that they're going to feel guilty just dropping on the floor. And the chances of it being read are fairly high because you're not demanding much of them. And these kinds of things, I just think, all serve to mutually reinforce, to become part of, or a nodule on that infrastructural web that we're rebuilding as evangelists.
I remember many decades ago being involved in a Billy Graham crusade, and they said their publicity, which they put out, they put massive publicity, posters everywhere. But they said 1 in 1,000 people who would have come because they saw the publicity.
Mm-hmm.
But the publicity made it so much easier for people to invite other people.
Yes.
They weren't starting from scratch. They weren't saying, oh, this American is coming. Everybody's heard of him because the publicity is around. And so it's much easier to say to your non-Christian neighbor, or say, whatever, I'm going to this. Would you like to go?
Yeah.
And it's a lot of this, isn't it? What you're saying is, if people are aware that we're there, then it's that much easier to make the invitation. I mean, a few people will just wander in because of it directly, but mostly it's the other way. And I think you mentioned that, so your friends, people saying their friends knew about their church.
Precisely.
Yeah.
I love that example you've just given. Hadn't thought of it in those terms in a formal sense, but you're absolutely right. I think it's about generating awareness. Now think, 1,000 years ago, in these very lands we inhabit today, the awareness would have been intrinsic, right? The village would have been built with the parish church at the center. Indeed, directions of streets in those villages would have been oriented according to the orientation of the church building itself. So the architecture would have informed people. Even though, and I live in a place where the Gothic revival was very influential, and you've got a lot of arched doorways with trefoil designs in them. And that in itself is an architectural head nod to the Trinity. We're still surrounded by some of these symbols, but there's no connection with them anymore at all, right? No awareness. But if we just rebuild that awareness, we create the conditions for engagement. It doesn't mean somebody's going to, if I point out that, these Gothic arches are headed by trefoil designs in them, and that's an allusion to the Trinity, that person's not going to show up at Divine Liturgy next week and get chrismated the week after. What it means is, along with bookmarks and conversations and seeing a guy walking down the street and everything, it's building up a context in which this becomes normal and possibly even good.
I don't want to talk over anybody else if somebody else wants to talk, but the social media aspect I've been heavily into, and I think it's the same experience of it overtaking you, especially if you can get invested into the many ridiculous comments that can come out of all that just simply are just trying to be disruptive or whatever. But the drop and go method sounds like the best method, and not obviously spending your entire time on it, which I've been guilty of in the past. But yeah, I like that. That was a good point to make.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a really, especially for me, and I mean, this will be something of a testimonial, I suppose, that will end up finding traction online once it's broadcast. But I don't mind that. The fact is, social media became a real bane for me, not least because of its the ready access I had on my phone. And when I think back to 2008, I think that is the year prior to the iPhone, I think about the fact that I was a voracious reader. From the day of my intellectual awareness, my first sort of, my first exposure to books, to about 2008, I was a voracious reader. Then I got a phone, and my reading went down in inverse proportion to my tech use. And when my wife and I noticed it, especially among our younger children who have grown up in an iPhone world, it became really disturbing. And I could hardly chastise them for it or try to redirect them when I myself was subject to it. So just this summer, we did a tech crackdown. This sounds really harsh, but we just decided as a family that we were all going to dispel ourselves of it, get rid of it. And so I think in some cases, some of my kids have chosen to just delete their accounts. I still have my accounts, but I can only and do only access them on my desktop, which means having to log in via a browser, not an app, and using it as drop and go. And that's I'm happy with the way that is working right now. But the positive effect it has had, and this does relate to mission because of what I was talking about earlier regarding fuel in and and what comes out. My spiritual life, my intellectual life, I would argue even my mental health has improved because I've been reading. I'm under less pressure because I don't look at incoming communication constantly. I'm not looking for any kind of dopamine hit. And I just feel like a healthier person overall. And that, the relationship between that and our Orthodox, our mission, our vocation to mission is fundamental. So, yeah, I would advocate to anyone here, anyone listening to this afterward or viewing it afterward, by all means, use social media as necessary, which is as a tool through which we might communicate, but then get off it and leave it alone and think in real terms, because evangelism doesn't happen online per se. It happens in life, and online should be and is only a tool. Yeah. Thank you. I think with that, we might wind up. We have run 40 minutes beyond the original scheduled time, but it has been a joy, and I'm glad you're all here. I thank you for signing up. I will get in touch with the 2 people who signed up but did not appear, make sure they're okay. But please don't hesitate to maintain contact with me. I can be reached through the email by which I sent you the link. And of course, I'm easy to find online in terms of both parish and Orthodox Exchange. So keep in touch. Otherwise, please, share the ideas we've talked about. Once this video is produced, I'll let you all know. Encourage other people to watch it if you think it's going to be helpful for them. And when there are future events, because this is an important topic, I think, and one that I want to proliferate as best I can. Please encourage people to get involved, and we'll continue the conversation in order to contribute what we can to the life of the church. Thank you all very much for being here. May God bless you. And as I say, let us continue to both keep the conversation going and be in touch with one another.